fabric, material, robes. That's what we're focusing on today. We needed to paint up this monk from our Imperial Agents combat patrol, which is based on the Catholic Church. And on here, there's two different types of materials that we could paint up. One is more of a rougher, more rustic woolen style fabric, while the other is a slightly lighter, silkier, softer fabric. And we're going to be covering both of them in this video, starting off with the brown robes. Here, we are going to be painting the outer robes in a brown base coat, making sure to cover all of the robes in this nice mid-brown, which will probably take a couple of passes in order to build out a nice clear coat. Once we've done that, we will need to build out a little bit of brightness, and we're going to be doing that by taking a lighter, brighter yellow-brown and then mixing this into our base coat. We will be using this mix as our first overall highlight, but rather than applying a large flat panel or plane of paint, what we want to do is dilute the mix and then apply it in multiple thin strokes. We want to pick out the majority of the robe on the first round doing this, primarily focusing in one direction, before we then pivot the model, change the angle and reapply the paint in, again, multiple smaller strokes, this time obviously in an alternate direction. After a few passes and a few direction changes, we should end up with a relatively smooth transition to the brighter highlight color we're using, which will show brighter on the areas where multiple passes have been applied. We're going to be using this scratchy application as the method for most of the brown robes here. It will help to build out a nice texture and show that effect that we're trying to build. Here, what we want is nice small lines where possible, and you can spend as much time as you want getting nice thin lines. Naturally, it will just take longer if you're doing more precise lines, but it will overall look better. So if you want to spend the extra time and focus on some thin brush work and line work, it might be a good opportunity to spend a little bit of extra time building up those highlights over precise areas rather than going for larger areas overall. We will be continuing to build out the highlights by taking our yellow-brown from the earlier mix and using this, thinning it down once again before we start to apply more scratchy lines as a highlight. This time though, we are going to be focusing on more of the raised areas on the sculpted fabric, building on our past work, but aiming to pull it towards the brightest points. Once we are happy with the application of this, what we want to do is add a little bit of a cream flesh into our yellow brown and then use this to apply our last round of highlights. Once again, scratching out a thin texture on the most raised edges of those billowing robes. We will need to be more precise and controlled here because we are specifically picking out the thinnest edges and we want to maintain that strokey striped textured pattern. From here, what we're going to do is start to blend back some of that past work by making a very, very thin glaze of our base coat brown and then using this to glaze from our brightest points to our shadows, bringing in a nice tonal change. This will also catch some of the areas that we've painted with texture, blending them also into the shadows. This essentially finishes off the brown, and I really like the effect that we come off with here, and I tend to use this if I'm trying to give off a rough texture on a fabric, something like burlap or potentially a rough spun wool. And I think this really works quite quickly in order to do that. But sometimes you might want to paint a fabric that's a little bit softer, say linen or cotton or something like that. And that's what we're doing for the white aspects of this robe, which we're painting in a different style and naturally in white. So let's jump in and paint that now. For this, we are going to be taking the creamy flesh tone that we used on the brown robe, but this time we are going to be using that as a base coat for all of our white sections. Once again, this will probably take a couple of coats in order to get a nice, clean, smooth coat. But once that initial base coat is applied, we can move over to the next step, which is to cover the majority of the elements in a lighter flesh tone color. This will be in order to leave the base coat color in the deepest, darkest shadows. And then we have this as a center point to work from, which we're going to use now and pull some of the color out of the area by mixing some neutral gray and applying this mix in thin, flat layers across the raised and flat planes of the fabric. We can apply a few coats, slowly mixing in a little bit of neutral gray until we move away from the warm hue shadows into a brighter, paler surface color. This can then be reinforced by taking some pure neutral grey, going over the areas that we've highlighted as an highlight similar to an edge highlight, but not quite reaching as thin as an edge highlight. And that's because once we've put down this grey, we're going to take a little bit of a white and mix that into our grey that we've just used, and then use this new brighter, paler colour and apply this as an edge highlight to all of the robes. Now, we're not finished with the robes yet. Similar to the browns, there's a little bit of futzing that we can go in just to push it a little bit cleaner and make it a little bit smoother. But if you're doing a large amount of models and you don't really want to be painting a lot of white, this is a good time to stop. For majority of tabletop models, this will be perfectly fine and it should read as white. But if you want to spend that little bit extra time like we're doing here, let's jump back into the model. First, we are going to need our base coat creamy flesh tone, and then we want to make a glaze out of this colour. Then, similar to when we shaded the brown robes, we want to apply this across the whites. But rather than just targeting the shadows as we did before, we essentially want to hit all of the robes lightly, but pulling more colour into the recesses. Then, once this has had time to dry and slightly tinted the robe, we can go back in with our white grey mix from earlier and then use this to apply a thin edge highlight in the form of edge spot highlights, and then use this to raise the areas that are going to be hit by the most light, leaving a slightly warm shadow. And that essentially finishes off the fabrics. That gives us a nice white without it just being bland in the shadows. We've got a nice warm nuanced shadow while we have a nice white crisp robe. And then we've obviously got the rusticy brown robe that we've already painted. For the rest of the model, it was just a case of picking out the various elements and painting them up appropriately. So we've done the big Imperial symbol or Inquisitor symbol with some metallics. We've done a nice dark skin tone on this model, as well as a few other things to bring it in line with the other models I've already painted for the army. So if you want to see how we paint those elements, you'd need to let me know down in the comments, because this is obviously just focusing on the fabric, so I haven't got the rest of that footage here for you, though I do have it, so don't worry if you want to see it. With that all said, you might want to check out the army that this guy's going with, or should I say the Vigilant Squad, which is what we've already painted for our Imperial Agents, and that was painted to look like the Swiss Guard. And if you want to see that video, you can find it here. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.